She was just doing her job. 6 hours in that kitchen, 6 hours of precision, of care, of every detail placed exactly where each needed to be. She was a black woman who had fought for every inch of space she occupied in rooms that were never built with her in mind. In that night, she had cooked the most honest meal that mansion had ever seen. Then a woman in a gold dress picked up a cup of hot coffee. He threw it directly at her neck. The burning liquid hit her skin before she could move. The tray tilted. The glasses shattered across white marble. He through the pain, through the heat rising on her neck, she heard those words, spoken with a smile. Clean it up. That's what you paid to do, isn't it? The entire table went silent. 7 people, 7 witnesses. Not one of them moved. But then, at the head of the table, the most dangerous man in the room stood up. Park Jae-won, Korean Mafia boss. A man whose name made businessmen straighten their posture without knowing why. A man with dragons tattooed up his neck and a stillness about him that felt less like a peace and more like a loaded weapon at rest. He walked toward that woman slowly. No hashi, no theater. What he said next. What he made her do on that marble floor. In front of everyone. Nobody at that table would ever forget it. But what happened after the quiet of the kitchen? Long after the guests had gone, that was the part that changed everything. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what chimich is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a member and help our channel. She had learned, early without mercy, that the kitchen was the only room where no one could take anything from her. In every other space, the dining rooms of Belware, the rooftop terraces of Century City, the marble-floored foyers of men whose names never appeared in newspapers, Lila Carter moved carefully, precisely, the way a woman learns to move when she understands, without being told, that she is both essential and invisible. That the food must be extraordinary and the hands that magic must never be discussed. She had made peace with it. Or she had told herself she had. Her knives were wrapped in Japanese linen. Her mise en place was architecture. She arrived at the Park Estate at 2 in the afternoon and spent the first 30 minutes simply standing in the kitchen, reading the space the way a musician reads a stage before soundcheck. The ceilings were high. The ventilation was excellent. The cookware was obscenely good, the kind of equipment that told you the person who ordered it had been advised by someone who actually cooked, not someone who simply owned things. She noted that, filed it away. She had researched Park Jae-won the way she researched every client, not the rumors, not the whispers that followed a name like his through certain circles in Los Angeles, but the small verifiable facts. His mother had come from Brazil. He had lived in the United States since he was 19. He simply when left to himself. He kept a small pot of drejug in the back of every refrigerator in every property he owned, which told her something the background check ever could. She built the menu around it. 6 hours. The bibimbap was deconstructed but honest. She had learned the trick not from culinary school but from a woman named Suk who ran a small cart in Jackson Heights, and made the egg with a precision that bordered on spiritual. The galbi braised low and slow until the meat remembered what each was supposed to be. The dessert was a whisk cheesecake built on a doenjang base, caramel with a miso pole that arrived on the palate 2 seconds after the first bite, like a memory someone had genuinely expected to have. She plated everything herself. She always did. The guests arrived at 8. She watched from the service corridor her standard position, close enough to read the table, far enough to remain architecture. Park Jae-won sat at the head, and she noticed immediately what others in that room likely noticed though he chose not to remark upon, the absolute quality of his stillness. Not the stillness of a man who was calm, the stillness of a man who had decided, long ago, that movement was a resource not to be wasted. The tattoos on his neck caught the candlelight when he turned his head. When the first plate arrived in front of him, he stopped. Not a polite pause, a full stop. The kind of stop that happens when something bypasses the social layer of a person and reaches something older and deeper. He looked at the dish for a long moment. Then he looked toward the corridor. She met his eyes without meaning to. He said nothing, looked away, picked up his chopsticks. Lila exhaled slowly and stepped back into the shadow of the corridor. Wow. Her left hand found the thin gold bracelet on her wrist her grandmother had worn thin from decades and then from her own years of reaching into ovens, lifting heavy pans, working in rooms that never put her name on the menu. She was thinking about the dessert time when she heard the side door open. The perfume arrived before the woman did. Heavy, floral, deliberately too much for a room this size, the olfactory equivalent of a hand slammed on a table. Neither recognized the type before she saw the face, someone who had learned to use their interest as a weapon. And then the woman walked in, blonde hair catching every light source in the room like it had been rehearsed, a wine glass already in her hand, a smile already deployed like a flag planted in enemy territory. The temperature of the room changed, not loudly, quietly, the way a sky changes before a storm that everyone sees coming and no one leaves for. Park Jae-won did not move. That was the first thing Lila noticed she had learned, years of working rooms like this one, that the first thing you notice is almost always the most important thing. Every other mirage at that table shifted, microscopically, barely perceptible, but she saw each a slight lean back, a hand that moved toward a glass without drinking from each, a jaw that tightened under a polite expression, the small involuntary adjustments of people recalibrating to an unexpected variable. Jae-won simply looked at the woman, the way you look at a forecast you had already accounted for. Brittany Hale moved through the dining room like she owned the architecture, her gold dress catching the low candlelight in a way that suggested she had chosen each specifically for candlelit rooms. She pulled out a chair, not a spare chair, not a chair at the edge of the table, but a chair directly in the center of one side, between two of the Korean businessmen who clearly had no idea who she was or what she represented. She sat down with the easy confidence of someone who had never once in her life been told that she was in the wrong room. Jay, querido. Her voice carried just enough honey to make the venom underneath each interesting. I heard you finally learned to read properly. One of the American businessmen laughed, a short, reflexive sound that he immediately regretted when no one joined him. Jae-won said to his chopsticks though. Parallel. Precisely. You were invited. No, she agreed cheerfully, reaching for an empty wine glass and filling each from the open bottle nearest to her. But I am anyway. Funny how that works. From the service corridor, Lila watched. She had seen this dynamic before, not in rooms this expensive, but the architecture of each was universal. A woman performing control in a space where she had lost it. The louder the performance, the more complete the loss. Brittany Hale was performing very loudly. Neither checked her watch. The dessert needed 4 more minutes before each was ready to her plate. She turned back toward the kitchen. She heard Jae-won speak again, quieter this time, the tone a person uses when they are giving a final instruction rather than making a request. She did not hear the exact words. She heard the quality of them. She was lifting the first dessert plate when she heard the chair scrape. She was carrying the tray to the service door when she felt Brittany's eyes find her the specific weight of a gaze that isn't the curious, isn't the neutral, but is searching for something to land on. Lila had felt that particular kind of attention before though. It always came from the same place, someone in pain who needed to redirect each somewhere that felt safe to her. She did not look up. She moved to the table. She began placing the dessert plates with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to make each look effortless, which was its own kind of invisibility, the invisibility of competence, of people who work so well that the work itself disappears. She was reaching across to sit the third plate when Brittany's hand closed around the coffee cup. Later, Lila would not be able to reconstruct the exact sequence. She remembered the heat before she understood what had happened. A sharp, flooding sensation across her left shoulder in the side of her neck immediate in total, the kind of pain that does not build but arrives all at once, like a door being kicked open. The tray tilted. Two glasses hit the table and shattered. She heard herself make a sound she had not planned to make. She gripped the edge of the table, studied. Her vision went briefly white at the edges. When each cleared, Brittany was standing, and the smile on her face was the most honest expression Lila had seen from her all evening. "Clean it up," Brittany said. Her voice was light, almost bored. "That's what you paid to do, isn't it?" The table was absolutely silent. Nida straightened slowly. Her left hand found the bracelet on her wrist automatic, unconscious, the way a person touches a scar. The skin on her neck was beginning to rise. She could feel it. She kept her face still and her spine vertical through an act of will that cost her more than anything visible in that room would ever know. She did not look at J1. She did not look at anyone. She looked at a fixed point on the far wall and breathed. It was in that breath, that single, controlled, devastatingly dignified breath, that the chair at the head of the table moved. Not scraped, not pushed back urgently. It moved the way J1 moved, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once in his adult life needed to rush toward anything, because things tend to stop and wait for him. He stood. He walked around the table slowly, hands loose at his sides, the candlelight catching the ink on his neck as he moved the dragon's coin upward toward his jaw, the characters that the people in that room could not read but whose presence communicated something that required no translation. He stopped in front of Brittany, close, not threatening in any theatrical way. Simply close, in the way that I always close, present and immovable and completely indifferent to whether you find it inconvenient. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, quietly, in a voice that carried through every corner of that silent room, "You going to get on your knees? You going to pick up every piece of broken glass from this floor with your hands?" Brittany blinked. The smile flickered. "Jay, you can't be me not going to say it again." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full-packed this with the held breath of 7 people who understood, with sudden complete clarity, exactly where the boundaries of this room were and who had just walked past all of them. A security guard appeared at the edge of the room. J1 raised 2 fingers without turning his head. The guard stopped. A folded towel appeared on the floor in front of Brittany, placed there by the assistant who had materialized silently from somewhere near the wall, the way people in houses like this one always materialize, present before they were summoned. Brittany looked at the towel, looked at the room, looked at J1. She got on her knees. The sound of Brittany as he scraping against the marble floor was the only sound in the room for a long time. No one spoke. No one reached for their wine. No one performed the small social rituals that people in rooms like this one usually performed to signal that everything was fine, that the evening was continuing, that the discomfort was manageable. There was no managing this. There was only watching each. Either watching itself was a kind of verdict. Neither had not moved. She stood at the edge of the table with one hand still resting on the surface, her neck burning underneath the surface calm of her expression, as she watched Brittany Hale collect broken glass from the floor of a mansion she had once called home, piece by piece, the gold dress pulling around her knees on the white marble, the wine glass she had filled so casually 20 minutes ago now sitting half empty above her, at a table where she had never been invited to sit. Lila recognized something in the image that she did not have immediate words for. Not satisfaction, it wasn't clean enough to be satisfaction. Something more complicated. The particular vertigo of watching the physics of a room suddenly run in the opposite direction. She became aware of J1 standing beside her before she heard him move. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared in her peripheral vision, and then she turned, and he was there closer than she had expected, looking at the side of her neck with an expression that was not pity, it was not performance, but was something quieter and more functional than either of those things. Assessment. The expression of someone cataloging damage with the intention of doing something about it. He said one thing in Korean. "Lo, directed toward the far side of the room. His personal assistant crossed the spacey seconds, slipping out through a side door without a word. "You can sit," he said. Yemi finished standing. He looked at her for a moment, not with the irritation of a mere being contradicted with something closer to recognition. He nodded once, slightly. He said nothing more about it. The assistant returned with our first aid kit before Lila had finished processing the fact that one had been requested. J1 opened it himself, took out a gel cooling compress, broke the seal with one hand. He held it out. Nyla looked at it. "Your neck," he said simply, as if that were the entire explanation, as if it were obvious that when someone was burned under his roof, the correct response was immediate, impersonal, and required no ceremony. She took the compress, pressed it against the side of her neck. The relief was immediate and almost embarrassing in its intensity. She had been holding herself so carefully against the pain that the release of it made her jaw loosen slightly before she caught herself. He watched her do that, watched her catch herself, and had the particular grace to look away. Behind them, Brittany had finished with the glass. She was still on her knees, hands shaking slightly, a thin line of ridge across two of her fingers where an edge had found her. She was looking up at J1 with an expression that had moved through several phases in the last few minutes, and had arrived somewhere stripped of its earlier performance, something hid underneath, something that looked almost startlingly like the face of a person rather than the mask that had walked through the door. "J. Marcos," one of the security guards stepped forward. "See her out. Call her car. A pause. Make sure the gate closes behind it." Brittany stood slowly. She smoothed the front of her dress with a reflex that was almost heartbreaking in its automaticity, the gesture of a woman whose entire architecture of self required her to look composed regardless of what had just happened to her. She picked up her clutch from the table. She did not look at Lila. She walked toward the door with her chin level, and her eyes fixed forward, and for just a moment, one unguarded moment before the door closed, her face did something that Lila almost looked away from. Not because it was ugly, because it was too legible, because it was the face of someone realizing, with fully final clarity, that the life they had lost was not coming back. The door closed. The room exhaled. J1 returned to his seat at the head of the table. He picked up his chopsticks. He looked at the two remaining businessmen who had sat in complete stillness for the last several minutes and said something in Korean but made both of them reach for their glasses with the coordinated relief of men who had been granted permission to be normal again. The dinner continued. Nyla went back to the kitchen. She moved through the remaining service on a kind of autopilot that she had developed over years of working in situations that required her to be functional regardless of what her body or her feelings were doing. She plated the remaining desserts. She washed what needed washing. She wrapped what needed wrapping. She did it all with the compresses still held to her neck, switching hands when one arm tired. At some point she became aware that she was alone, that the guests had gone, that the house had gone quiet in the specific way that large houses go quiet after events, a silence that was somehow louder than the noise that preceded it. She sat down the last clean pair. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at her own hands for a moment, steady, practiced, bearing the small permanent marks of her profession, the thin scars and calloused edges that no one in that dining room would ever accumulate. Her grandmother had hands like these. Her grandmother had also never once in her life been invited to sit at the table she cooked for. Lila thought about that, let herself think about it fully, in the quiet of the kitchen, which was the only room where no one could take anything from her. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor. She did not turn around immediately, not out of fear, and not out of defiance, but because she had learned, in the particular education that comes from spending years in other people's houses, that the quality of a moment could be reading the sound of someone else's approach before they arrived. Whether the footsteps were purposeful or hesitant, whether they slowed near the door or came straight through, whether the person entering a room owned each or was borrowing each. These footsteps weren't hurried. They came straight through. She turned. J1 stood in the entrance of the kitchen with his jacket removed and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was the first time she had seen him look like anything other than a man constructed entirely of control. The tattoos continued, though his forearms she could see that now. Dragons e geometric forms e characters she couldn't read. Dank, decent, deliberate, the kind of work that takes years e means something specific to the person wearing it. He looked around the kitchen briefly, taking inventory the way she had taken inventory when she first arrived, reading the space for what each said about the person who built it. Then he looked at her neck. You should have that looked at you properly, he said. I will. Tonight. I heard you the first time. Something shifted in his expression, not irritation, something that might, on a different face, have been the beginning of a smile. He crossed to the far side of the kitchen and stood at the counter, not leaning against the posture of a man who had somewhere to be but had decided, for reasons of his own, that this was where he was going to be for the next few minutes. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was the thing that surprised her most. In her experience, silence with powerful men was always a kind of test space they created to see what you would fill each with, to measure the shape of your anxiety. This silence was different. Each was simply two people in a kitchen at the end of a long evening, occupying the same space without performing for each other. She folded a dish towel, set it on the counter. You didn't have to do that, she said. Out there. I know. She is not worth the trouble she is about to cause you. She won't cause any trouble, he said. Not as a threat. As a simple statement of fact, the way a person might observe that it was unlikely to rain when the sky was clear. Lila looked at him for a moment. You aren't asking to be protected, she said. I want to be clear about that. You were asking. He agreed. I didn't do it because you asked. Then why? He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that doesn't evasion but was instead a person locating the honest answer rather than the convenient one. Because it happened in my house, he said finally. And because some things, once you allow them, become the standard. I don't accept the standard. She considered that. It was not the answer she had expected, which was precisely why it landed the way it did, not as a performance of nobility but as a statement of personal architecture. The logic of a man who had built his entire existence on the premise that what you permit defines what you are. She understood that logic. She had lived by a version of it her entire career. The Beppy, he said then, his voice changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, a slight loss of the controlled evenness, something underneath each that was older and less managed. Where did you learn to make the egg that way? She told him about Souk, the Cardiac heights. The way the older woman had never once measured anything but had produced the same result every single time, with the consistency of someone whose hands remembered what her mind no longer needed to consciously direct. She watched his face while she talked. She watched him hear the name. He turned away not quickly enough, and she suspected he knew each and looked at the far wall of the kitchen for a long moment. His jaw worked once, slightly. His right hand rested flat on the counter with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. This one cost him something. She was in Jackson Heights for almost 8 years, he said. Te deu ao. Te no one in particular. After she left Buzzer. Before he stopped. The before hung in the air between them, complete and sufficient without whatever was supposed to follow it. Lila did not fill the silence. She let it be what it was. She taught anyone who wanted to learn, Nida said quietly. She didn't keep anything back. She said the whole point of knowing something was that you gave it away. He was still for a long moment. Then he turned back, and his face had been reassembled into its usual composure, but the reassembly was visible in a way it hadn't been earlier in the evening, and she thought that he probably knew that too, and had decided to allow it, which was its own kind of trust. The dessert, he said. The jug caramel. Yes, 2-second delay on the finish, she said. I wanted it to feel like a memory arriving late. He looked at her directly then fully, without the slight calculation that had been present every previous glance across the evening. That look she saw something she had not expected there find that house, behind that face, underneath all that silence ink. Controlled power. She saw someone who had been eating in rooms like the dining room for 20 years and had stopped, somewhere along the way, actually tasting anything. He left the kitchen without ceremony, the way he had entered it. No dramatic exit, no final line, simply the decision that the moment was complete, executed with the same precision he brought to everything. She stood in the kitchen alone. She looked at her hands again. This time she did not think about what they had never been given. She thought about what they had built. Everything they had carried and constructed and produced in rooms that were not designed for them, on behalf of people who did not always deserve the care she brought to the work. She thought about Suk, who had stood at Chakotay Jackson Heights and made the same egg every day for 8 years and given the knowledge away freely, without keeping score, without requiring that the people she taught understand the full weight of what they were receiving. She understood it now, standing in this kitchen, at the end of this night. Some things pass through people. Some things travel through hands, through recipes, through the specific muscle memory of a technique learned from a woman who learned it from another woman, crossing oceans in decades and arriving finally on a plate in a candlelit room in Los Angeles where a man who had not tasted his mother is cooking in more than 20 years stopped mid-breath and looked toward the corridor where a woman stood, not asking for anything, simply doing her work with everything she had. The envelope arrived 6 days later. She recognized the handwriting on the outside as precise and spare, the handwriting of someone who wrote rarely and therefore wrote carefully. Inside, a contract with terms that were, by any reasonable measure, obscene, a card with a single phone number, and below it, in English that carried the faint formal weight of a second language chosen deliberately over a first, food made this way should not be wasted on business. J. She set the card on her kitchen counter. She stood there for a long time, in her own kitchen, in her own space, surrounded by her own knives and her grandmother's bracelet hanging on the cabinet handle where she left it when she cooked at home. Then she opened the refrigerator, took out what she needed, turned on the burner. She cooked for no one. She cooked because it was the truest thing she knew how to do. This translation of care into something that could be consumed, this act of taking the invisible interior of a person and making it briefly, beautifully legible. Outside, Los Angeles moved through its evening the way it always did, enormous and indifferent and full of rooms where people performed power for each other and confused the performance for the real thing. Inside, the egg cooked slowly. The yolk stayed whole. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been in a room where you gave everything you had, your skill, your care, your absolute best, and someone tried to reduce you to nothing with a single gesture? Have you ever been protected by someone you never expected? He had to decide whether to accept that grace without losing yourself in the process. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments, we read them all. If you believe these stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of those who never stop showing up, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.